Hello and welcome to a combined effort by Fire of Learning and Mr. Z to ask, who were the Celts? What is their fascinating history? And most of all, what if their history had changed, and the Celtic nation-state had emerged in ancient times? This is part 2 of that video, so be sure to head over to Mr. Z's channel to see part 1, the link to which will be in the description. However, if you have seen that video, let's continue. By the 2nd century BC, Rome had control over the Italian peninsula and was expanding around the Mediterranean, which inevitably brought them into closer contact and conflict with the Celts in southern France and northern Spain. The Celts of Spain are a more forgotten branch, though archaeology and research reveals a stronger presence than expected in places such as Asturias and Galicia, the latter region having been named after the Gallic tribe, which, as you may expect, is related to the word Gaul. The Celts Iberians would be among the first to fall to the Romans, apart from, of course, the Celts that were living in northern Italy, as Rome controlled much of the Iberian Peninsula by 130 BC. As time went on, Roman power fueled its continued expansion ever farther, even into lands which were mysterious and unknown. The Roman who would move the empire's focus northward into terra incognita and deal a huge blow to the Celts was none other than Julius Caesar. From his stronghold in northern Italy and southern France, he moved to subdue Gaul, and added it to the domains of the Roman Republic. At this time, now the 1st century BC, Rome could boast to be the greatest power in the world, though even peoples it regarded as barbarians, such as the Germans and Celts, remained legitimate threats. Caesar may have, from time to time, exaggerated this threat to justify his expansion, but many historians do agree that the Celts of Gaul could have challenged and even potentially defeated Rome. Caesar's Gallic Wars began in 58 BC, and, largely owed to Caesar's leadership abilities, he was able to defeat them. As Caesar subdued the whole area of what is now modern-day France, however, a Celtic leader named Vercingetorix emerged to unite the tribes of Gaul and expel the invaders. He could very well have been successful. However, the Gallic lack of unity and their tactical ineffectiveness against the Roman army would be their downfall, and Caesar's victory was inevitable following the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC. 1 million Celts had died in this conflict, and another million had been enslaved. Rome would expand further into Celtic territory as time went on. A century or so later, in 43 AD, Britain was invaded. It is here again that we see many Celts join forces, this time around the year 60 AD, under the warrior queen Boudica. And it is here again that they were almost victorious, but in the final moments of the war, Boudica was killed and the Romans reversed the course of events and ended up conquering much of the island. The only heavily Celtic areas outside of the Roman Empire now were Scotland and Ireland, with some tribes mixed into what the Romans called Germania, Germany. Celtic culture did not disappear, however, even under Roman occupation. In fact, in some areas, a mixed Romano-Celtic culture emerged. A good indicator of this is language. There was cross-influence in Rome's new provinces, and we still today see Romance languages, children of the Latin language, like French and Galician, with a little bit of Celtic influence, and Celtic languages with Latin influence, such as Welsh.
In this timeline, Rome's focus had shifted from northward expansion to dominance of the south. As far as the Roman populace was concerned, the Celtic Confederation was already Roman land, so it only made sense to expand into lands that they didn't hold dominance in. Specifically for the up-and-coming Julius Caesar, he would develop an admiration of Alexander the Great, and upon encountering a statue of Alexander during one of his tours, he would realize that at the age of 31, he was now at the age at which Alexander had nearly conquered the known world. And as in our timeline, it would shake something within him that would motivate out of the young Caesar a desire for conquest of Asia, to push deep into the east, topple the Parthian Empire, and spread Roman reach to the peaks of India. And with Roman strength now strategically concentrated down the African east coast, as well as across the Mediterranean, so did the opportunity present itself, a naval raid and conquest of southern Arabia, to establish a launch-off point for sea invasion of India and Persia, while land forces drawing upon Celtic recruits spearheaded into Parthian lands. The Celts, becoming a force capable of fending off Germanic invasion, serve as a buffer to protect Rome from barbarian invasion, and the faulty recruitment of Germanic soldiers who would ultimately turn on them, though this couldn't stop the same mistakes from being made in the eastern campaigns by Julius Caesar. As Galicia becomes increasingly more independent from the Roman Empire, so did the Roman government become increasingly concerned about the potential threat the Celtic state may pose, thus triggering a poorly orchestrated invasion of Galicia, while Roman efforts were focused on the east. This Roman defeat would set the tone for the next century of decline for the empire. North African lands would start fracturing away, breaking off to be claimed by inland groups which Roman resources were exhausted on. Caesar's campaigns would have made him quite popular to some, as he had extended Roman influence further and further into Asia, but back home it was becoming increasingly evident that these wars in the east were siphoning away necessary resources and manpower that were needed domestically. Caesar's men would be cut off and left to their own devices without food, water, and gold. The men would mutiny on their general and assassinate him, leading Eastern Roman spoils to fracture as well. Rome's government would face increasing instability and even face an invasion by the Celts in retaliation for Rome's attempts to subdue them, ultimately leading the Roman Empire to crumble and take on a new form in the following decades as the Akiane or Akiane Empire, comprised of Greece, the Balkans, parts of Italy, Anatolia, and the northeast African coast, with some few scattered ports about Europe, Africa, and Asia.
When the Roman Empire fell centuries later, the power vacuum that was left was filled primarily by Germanic tribes, like the Angles, Saxons, and Franks, which is partly why Celtic culture and society didn't make as much of a resurgence in the post-Roman world. The Romano-Celts who were living in Gaul were assimilated into Frankish society and became the French. The only exception to this is Brittany, which retains its Celtic heritage today. Although the Bretons are not descendants of the original French Gauls, they are descendants of British Celts, who migrated to the region later on. Spain was taken over by the Germanic Visigoths and Suebi peoples. In England, a similar process occurred when the Romano-Britons were overtaken by the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, though many Celts fled westward to form the modern nation of Wales and the territory of Cornwall, and as I said, migrated to France and would later become the territory of Brittany, each of these places tracing their heritage back to their Celtic Briton heritage. Scotland, Ireland, and the Isle of Man, who had effectively retained independence, later joined Wales, Brittany, and Cornwall to become the 6 Celtic nations of the modern day, although some would include Galicia and Asturias in Spain, making it, arguably, 8 Celtic nations. For much of history, their Celtic identity was suppressed or at times even lost. It would not completely disappear, however, and there were independent Celtic nations for much of European history. However, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Brittany was absorbed into France, Iberian Celtic culture had already been absorbed in the fighting between the Germanic tribes, the invading Muslims, and the other ethnic groups of Spain, and the other Celtic nations came under the rule of the English crown, becoming Britain. Yet Celtic identity and heritage would begin a resurgence in the 18th century or so, and in the modern day their identity is, in some ways, perhaps the strongest it's been in centuries, yet in other ways it may be the weakest. The only truly independent Celtic nation is the Republic of Ireland, and while the 6 Celtic nations themselves have today an estimated collective population of around 20 million people, only around 1 million can speak a Celtic language fluently. Although there are Celts living in North and South America and Oceania who can speak the languages as well. Most of the other Celts, such as those native to Spain or those who immigrated to the United States, do not retain a linguistic heritage, only being ethnically Celtic. Ancient Celtic history was changed by a few decisive moments, but if any of those moments had gone differently, things could have been drastically altered. Yeah, I think the Germanic tribes would be a good place to start looking because of the effect they had on the later Roman Empire. You have to wonder if they'd have a similar effect on the Celtic nation if they were to start migrating and pushing against the boundaries. And then
Yeah, precisely. The Celts would have ancestral animosity toward the Germanic tribes because they were the ones primarily feuding. Then they would have been pushed out. They're able to fend them off in this timeline and develop more of a rivalry with them. The question is, would the Germanic tribes advance a little faster, and would the Germanic tribes pose as much of a threat to Galicia as they had to Rome?
I could see them like mimicking the Celts because they had a similar tribal structure. Maybe they could go about unifying their own type of country in the same way the Celts had.
Right. They wouldn't have the benefits that Rome had given the Celts, but you could certainly see them observing and copying, as well as you might have some deserters from the Celtic state going over there and trying to organize something themselves. Not to mention Roman soldiers who would be in that region when Rome fell, or again, deserters from the Roman army who moved up that way. This timeline, Galicia invades northern Rome and captures portions of it in retaliation. So some northern Romans could have fled into the the Germanic region and attempted to unify it to create a new rival state to the Celts. It could be something of a Rome 2.0, but built with Germanic stock, or it could just be an independent Germanic state that forms out of purely without Roman influence. Which one do you think is more likely? Because again, you do have the deserters from the Eastern Roman Empire, and you have the Romans who would flee from northern Rome when Galicia invaded.
I guess Germany in this time was more cut off from interaction in Rome, and I guess what would be the Galician Empire here, so probably something that would be more
independent.
Yeah.
Yeah, you also got to consider that there would be far less Roman influence there, and thus they would speak different languages. Communication would just be near impossible between these two. So through imitation, the Germanic tribes try to create a state mimicking the Celts. Now, historically, the Germans were able to far outcompete the Celts. Caesar seemed to have some concern that the Celts posed a greater threat to Rome's future than the Germans did. Well, can you expand on that a little bit?
That pretty much goes back to the 4th century BC, when the Celts were active, or the Gauls were active in northern Italy and sacked the city of Rome. They were closer to Rome. They had more interactions with them. They were, at times, some of the tribes were friends with the Carthaginians. So there was kind of they were more of a threat to Rome because of proximity and past history, but there was also a vendetta, I guess, a sense of getting revenge.
Right. There's not necessarily a tactical or technological superiority of the Celts over the Germanic tribes.
Right.
Thus, the Germans outcompeting the Celts might be indicative that the Germans had the tactical and technological superiority. Could we see something perhaps akin to France and Prussia's rivalry arise between Galicia and the new Germanic state? Whereas Germany just rapidly manages to modernize and militarize, then combat Galicia and sort of drive them westward.
I could see that, yeah. I think the geography, like the Rhine River, just creates a natural boundary that's hard to cross and lays a foundation for two states to arise.
Right, and you think the Rhine River would be a good spot to just set the border between the two?
Yeah, I could see that over time. The Germans kind of pushed the Celtic nation back over the Rhine River, and from there, separate nation states would arise.
Well, what about the eastern border? So we established the western border, but now we also got to consider that the Slavs are still in that region. The Germans, because the Celts had repelled them and pushed them more eastward, had intermingled with the Slavs a little more, but perhaps they formed better relations, or perhaps they've developed a rivalry. But you do have them there, and eventually you're going to have the Huns and the Mongols flooding in, and thus the Slavs get pushed westward even more.
Yeah, I could see that creating a lot of tension in the whole area of Europe. I don't know if that would lead to the Slavs mimicking a nation state like the Celts and maybe the Germans would, but I was thinking that the Slavic invasions that happened in the 7th century or so, and then the Huns, and then later on the Mongols would put a lot of pressure on the Galician state.
Right, but Galicia is sort of protected, because again you have the Germanic tribes, and below that you have the alternate Byzantine Empire, which is creating something of a blockade. Galicia is safely nestled away in Western Europe. The issue that could be posed in the future would be that of the Umayyad Caliphate, which in this timeline probably wouldn't exist because Islam is far weaker, it just doesn't exist. You might also see, no, not even that. The Mongol hordes would most likely be stopped by Germany and the alternate Byzantine Empire, and that would really be, they have a buffer. Galicia is very well protected, and that might actually be a bit of a downfall for the Celts, because the Celts, they'd only need to face those two threats. Those two threats would be faced up against all the onslaught that's going to be going on in Central Europe, and Central Europe's going to become a real battleground, and thus they'll need to adapt to that. Because the Celts aren't facing any hardship, they might begin to slack a little bit and become a little softer.
Right.
Something which could prime them for a reconquest by the Byzantine Empire to retake more of the Italian peninsula, or maybe the Germanic tribes pushing further westward.
I can see that.
You can also see the Vikings, too. The Vikings pushing into Ireland and Scotland, but just as in our timeline, they'd probably be repelled even more so now since they're more prepared. And the matter of the Germanic state, it would likely be something akin to the Holy Roman Empire, where it'd be a bunch of it'd be a bunch of fairly autonomous tribes with maybe a high king ruling them.
Right.
Right, much like the Confederation. It is a confederation of tribes. Yeah, just looking at the map, you can see Galicia is very well protected by the Germanic tribes. We could see a primary Germanic nation forming along the borders of Galicia, just out of necessity to repel any advancement by the Celts and to combat them. So they'll just they could unify out of necessity. Again, with Galicia, it's very well nestled away. Its main competitors will likely be the Akiane Empire and Germanic tribes.
Right.
And that might soften it up. But there's the expansion of Galicia. If the Germanic tribes manage to unify into a state, they will likely be able to hold Galicia off at the Rhine River. So would that open the door for Galicia to expand into the New World, into Greenland, or maybe North Africa?
Uh,
Galicia is occupying all the major colonial powers, or at least their territory, and it's just a wide open stretch for it. It could go from Iberia and expand into, say, South America. It can go from directly from the British Isles and expand northward into Greenland or Canada, or from France. It should be a fairly straight shoot to mid-Canada or the U.S.
I could see that happening in later years if the nation stays intact. In this timeline, I still could see the Norse having gaining the upper hand out of necessity, navally, and still expanding into Iceland and Greenland on their own.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see them going into North Africa and stuff. Definitely, there's an incentive by owning Hispania.
We might not see Slavic expansion to the Balkans, however. That might remain Greco-Roman in culture. Do you think the state structure in Europe would be? Because clearly Galicia is something of a superstate. It's an empire much like Rome. But how long would Galicia last as an empire, and what lands do you believe it would retain?
I could see it fragmenting a lot more as it deals with the stresses of the Norse and the Germans and maybe the Magyars and maybe a African Eastern invader.
The Celtiberians themselves might feel distinct enough to create their own country, and thus Iberia could break off. That northern portion of the Italian peninsula might still consider itself Roman, and revolts could lead that to break off, as well as Corsica and Sardinia. Though I could see France and the British Isles being retained, as well as most of what would be Switzerland and Austria, since Switzerland is mostly the Alps, and I wouldn't imagine many people moving in there to invade. I could see the German tribes easily fragmenting and then reforming into a few different times into different states. And the Akiane Empire might be able to create a greater Greece. I could see the Greek and Anatolian portions of the Akiane Empire remaining a state, though I feel that the Italian portion of it might break off. This might or may not include Sicily. Sicily could be more influenced by the Akiane Empire and become a portion of it, but the Italian peninsula itself would likely break off and become its own independent state. And the Parthian Empire, I could see it holding a good dominion over much ancestral Persian land, but I'm not sure it would be able to retain a hefty hold over land holdings in southern Arabia.
That reminds me, I was going to mention the Akian Empire here. Doesn't look as much like as the Roman Empire. It looks more like a Greek Empire in Italy, which controls Italy. So I can definitely see the rest of the Greek lands kind of splitting.
Right. Overall, I think that's a pretty solid scenario. I'm glad we worked together, and I like the way the whole thing came together.
Yeah, absolutely, me too. Okay, well, thank you all for watching. For more videos like this, be sure to check out both of our channels.
This has been Mr. Z and Fire of Learning. See you next time. Shooting star right there.